I'm going to do what will hopefully be a quick video. This video was recommended to me in my YouTube comment sections from some slavery apologist, nonetheless. It's Pints with Aquinas, and this is Dr. John Bergsma. Let's see what he has to say about biblical slavery. I was told to watch this video, and essentially it ought change my mind. But I've yet to see one video that has even come close to changing my mind about biblical slavery, because the Bible 100% condones slavery. But let's get into it.
Kyle Whittington asks, does the Bible condone slavery?
Yes.
Actually not. I wrote my dissertation.
Well, there you go. Actually, it doesn't.
On the Jubilee laws, which are the laws of freedom. And so
the Jubilee laws so clearly apply only to the Israelites. It's laid out in the Bible that it applies to Israelites.
what you find out is that under Moses, true slavery is outlawed for Israelites. That's the point of Leviticus 25.
Oh, okay. I don't necessarily disagree with that, except in Exodus. Hold on, let's bring up Exodus. Actually, you know what? Exodus 25:7. If a man sells his daughter as a servant, she is not to go free as the male servants do. If she does not please the master who has selected her for himself, he must let her be redeemed. If a man sells his daughter as a servant, she is not to go free as the male servants do. So I would argue that the Jubilee laws, or the every 7-year laws, whichever one you want to go with, apply to Israelites, and they apply to male Israelites. The women get shafted, but I mean, it's the Bible, so.
You can indenture a fellow Israelite if he owes you money. That means you can make him work for you, okay? But you can't treat him like a slave. His civil rights are always intact. What that would look like, I don't know exactly in the ancient world, but he has civil rights as a free man. But yes, he can work for you to pay off his debt to a point, only to the Jubilee year, and then every 50th year, all this is canceled and everybody's freed and goes home.
Okay, so under God's version of slavery, you can be a slave for up to 50 years. I don't know.
So the worst thing that can happen to an Israelite is that you have to work for somebody to pay off your debt to them. It's kind of like indentured
Unless, of course, you're a female.
servitude. Now, the other people surrounding the people of Israel could be enslaved, but only temporarily. And this is what you find, for example, in Deuteronomy 15, and there's a parallel passage earlier in Exodus 21. It talks about Hebrew slaves. Now, the thing that people mistake about that is they think that Hebrew is synonymous with Israelite. It's not. Abraham was a Hebrew.
Okay, Abraham was a Hebrew. I would still strongly argue that Hebrew is virtually synonymous with Israelite. But let's see.
So all of Abraham's descendants are Hebrews as well. That includes the Ishmaelites, the Edomites, and a whole bunch of nations that we would regard as Semitic peoples, including most of the Arabs. Peoples that later settled in a ring around the nation of Israel, which is the logical place where they might get might purchase slaves. So in Deuteronomy 15, it allows the Israelites to buy slaves from the Hebrews, which would be the people surrounding them. But even there, it limits the term of slavery only for 6 years. And in the 7th year, you have to release even your foreigner.
No. I'm glad he's bringing up the Deuteronomy. He briefly mentions Exodus, but what about Leviticus 25:44? Your male and female slaves are to come from the nations around you. From them you may buy slaves. You can bequeath them to your children as inherited property and make them slaves for life. What? Explain this, please.
Has to be released, so it cannot be permanent unless they want it. Unless they feel like their position in your household is better than what they're liable to get anywhere else.
No, because even if you're... Oh my goodness. All right, hold on. We're gonna have to bring up Exodus. Well, no, I don't want to switch screens here, but essentially, Exodus states that on the seventh year, the slave is to go free. But if he has children while he's a slave, if the master gives the slave a wife, which is disgusting to begin with, but we'll roll with it. If the master gives the slave a wife and he has children and he goes free, the women and the children stay. So this slave has the option to go be a free man or be with his family. Yes, this is come on, be honest.
And then if they submit to it, then their earlobe can be pierced, and then they could become a permanent member of the household. And people say, like, why would you ever want to be a slave for your whole
Because your family is there.
life? Well, I'll tell you why. Employment security and benefits, like the ancient
Employment security. What is the employment? He just went through this whole spiel about how you could become a slave to pay off your debt. Paying off your debt is not employment. Let's just say your debt is paid off. Then that's not employment.
world was brutal.
Essentially, what he's implying is that he could go and a slave could stay and work and get paid a wage, but he's working to pay off a debt, not to make a profit.
Working for yourself was no fun. It was a good way to die.
Come on.
It was, as Jordan Peterson said, not good.
It's not good.
It's not good. Okay, a lot. Day laboring was not a very fun thing in the ancient world. If a day laborer was sick, he didn't eat that day because he didn't earn any money that day. Oftentimes, it was hand to mouth. And but a slave was a member of the household. If he got sick, he was cared for. The master, if for no other reason than the fact that he had a huge investment in this worker, would care.
I don't care about
care
this.
for you and nurse you back to health and so on, because he had invested a lot of money in you and needed your labor and so on. So
all right, apparently I got
slavery typically had benefits to it, and you frequently find in the ancient world that bonds of affection arose between masters and their servants in these situations, and people would sell themselves into slavery in order to gain the security that it offered over being a day laborer. That's hard for us to.
Okay, let's just grant all of this is true. Everything he said so far, let's just say that it's true. It's still pretty immoral. It's still pretty disgusting. You got to remember, these aren't laws that an ancient, okay, they are laws that an ancient people came up with, but that's not the story that's trying to be sold. These are God's laws. You can envision God is the governor of this society, and these are the laws and legislations that he has signed into law. This was the best that God can do for his society. Come on.
To get our minds around, in the modern age.
Was it chattel slavery, like is practiced in the New World? But
no, I think
people get that confused.
Yes, Leviticus 25, your male and female slaves are to come from the nations around you. From them you may buy slaves. You may also buy some of the temporary residents living among you and members of their clans born in your country, and they will become your property. You can bequeath them to your children as inherited property. You can make them slaves for life.
What's so perverse about slavery in the New World was it ended up as a race-based thing. And people have a hard time wrapping their mind around the fact that in the ancient world, it's like anybody could become a slave, whether you're Caucasian or African or Semitic or whatever. That was like equal opportunity employer, So anyway.
Yeah, I don't care about the race-based. Slavery is slavery. If it's race-based, if it's ethnic-based, if it's social-based, based on your social status, how much money you have. But if it's poor people based, financially based, it's all slavery, and it's all disgusting. And God could certainly have done better.
Ready.
Is this the best God can do? This was the best God can do in all of his infinite wisdom. This was the best society that he could create.
And within Egypt,
where people were literally so poor that they had to sell themselves into slavery, servitude. This was the best he could do. God's nation is the perfect example of a failing nation.
Egyptians themselves could be reduced to slavery if they committed a crime or something like that, and so it was not racial at all in the ancient world. So that's one thing you have to wrap your mind. And the other thing you got to wrap your mind around is that typically, there were expectations. There were cultural expectations, and legally, an owner might be able to be a real jerk. But there were social norms that were typically upheld, and most people did not want to be perceived as an evil person in the eyes of the rest of society. And so usually there was this effort to be humanitarian towards the people that worked for you.
Usually.
This Jubilee year.
Yeah.
So
to recap on the biblical thing. So Moses prohibits slavery for Israelites and even limits it for foreigners that the Israelites might buy. No more than 7 years unless they really like being part of your household. So that's the old
that was just a lie. He's lying. That's a lie.
Testament, And if that's the Old Testament, the freedom that we have in Christ,
come on,
shouldn't that, bespeak more? So you have the passages in Ephesians, for example, where Paul says, masters, do not be harsh with your slaves, and slaves obey your masters. And that's a pragmatic thing because there were huge numbers.
It's pragmatic. Oh my goodness. You know what's pragmatic? We know there's a pragmatic thing to say about slavery. Masters, free your slaves. Slaves, escape your masters. That's pragmatic about slavery. Master, at least I can understand why a slave might not want to escape his master because he'd pay. It wouldn't be good for the slave. But masters, free your slaves immediately. That's pragmatic. Obey your masters.
Of folks that were
so sorry,
dependent on their sustenance by their master, and Paul can't just make some kind of blanket fiat declaration that everybody free your slaves, because that could actually be non-humanitarian for a large number of people. That would put a lot of people out into the open marketplace, where they may or may not have had skills to really make it as day laborers.
Oh, you don't want to put an immediate end to slavery, because then the slaves, what would they do?
And the elderly servants in the Greco-Roman world, it was regarded as a noble thing to keep the elderly on your rolls as servants and allow them to do light labor into what we would regard their retirement years. And at that point, the household was not getting as much economic value out of these elderly servants as they were actually producing, if you know what I mean. There's like more care was involved in keeping them alive than they were doing by snapping peas in the kitchen. But that was regarded as a noble thing because there were these bonds, like they were part of the household and so on. So Paul doesn't do anything so rash as just say, well, everybody free your slaves, because that could lead to a lot of sick people, elderly people, weak people, etc. Out on the open.
Okay, everybody free your slaves because it's immoral to own other human beings. Also, everybody take care of the people who have been freed.
Marketplace and starving to death. But he does apply the law of love, and the law of do unto others what you would have them do to you, the golden rule. That applies in all situations, and that can redeem even situations that are like legally or economically non-advantageous. So if you're in a situation where this guy owns a bunch of slaves and it's really awkward if he tries to manumit them, and what are they all going to do if they're suddenly not part of his household, that's their source of sustenance. But he can treat them well, and they can treat him well.
Okay, let's take his argument and let's roll with it. Okay, fine. You don't want to just say slaves immediately free, or masters immediately free your slaves so they can become their own free people, which is the morally responsible thing to do. Let's go with his argument that would cause more harm than good. How about this? Masters, give your slaves the option to go free immediately. And if they choose to stay, then that's fine. But immediately give them the option to be free. That's better.
We can work past this, and then when there's an opportunity to change the way that society works, we can take that opportunity to, make institutions that are less, susceptible to being abused. But in the meantime, we got to do something. And what is that? Why, that's to love each other and to treat each other well within imperfect economic institutions.
So that argument right at the end there would have almost made a little bit of sense if these weren't God's economic institutions. Again, I've said it before, and I'll end the video with this. All of the stuff you read in the Bible about slavery makes perfect sense when you look at it through the lens of the time, through the context, as apologists like to say. It does. It makes perfect sense. They were an ancient, more ignorant than we are today people. I think they were doing kind of the best they could, given the culture, given the time, with the knowledge and information about human rights and freedom that they did have. I think that sums it up relatively well. The problem is when you add a God into this mix. A God should have known better. A God should have known that all of this was immoral, that all of this was wrong, and he just allowed it anyway. He didn't just allow it. He gave them the institution. The Israelites, or the Hebrews, whatever, as they were coming out of Egypt, wouldn't have had their own system of slavery. They were a newly freed people. They were supposedly slaves themselves. So they get freed from Egypt and they get to the promised land. And God's like, hey, do you remember how you guys were slaves in Egypt? Well, guess what? We're going to do that here as well. Here's the rules. So even if you were to grant all of this guy's arguments, it's still a really stupid way for a God, an omnibenevolent, omniscient, omnipotent God, to have a fresh, clean slate and still give them the institution of slavery.